Why? Uh, Often, I've spent a great deal of time in public positions over the last 40 years at all levels of government, from the White House down to City Hall, and a lot of time on dealing at the edge of policy and science, the edge of science and engineering, the edge of engineering and law. And one of the problems we have is communicating between us. And Cynthia is a national treasure because she's one of these brilliant scientists that really can communicate and dumb down things for the rest of us so that we understand what's going on. For me, Sandy was the tipping point. My wife, Kristen, who helped put on the symposium and who has been responsible for everything from the graphics here to the logistics to discussing the substance of it, and I own a antique floating lighthouse. And I've been through 4 hurricane-level events in that ship. We were in New York City when Sandy hit. We went up the Hudson away from the dock, and we were the second ship to come back into the port of New York. I had been talking about the concept of Nietzsche for a while, but it wasn't until we docked in New York City the day after Sandy that I realized we had hit the tipping point. To see the devastation, despite all the planning that had gone on, despite the foresight of having focus on climate change, a report in 2008, and then adapting it every year, it was clear to me that this triple threat of rising sea levels, extreme storms, and aging infrastructure is a true threat to our national security as well as our national economy. I wish every one of you could have come in on the lightship that day into New York City, seeing it dark in all of lower Manhattan, black, seeing all the traffic lights out, seeing water everywhere, parking garages filled with water, subway entrances filled with water. Cars had been floating around, and not seeing first responders because they were in emergency situations, literally putting out fires and saving lives and trying to get people out of hospitals into other hospitals. And then to go down the New Jersey Turnpike and seeing cars backed up for 3 miles trying to get a gallon or 2 of gas, and then coming home and having no electricity for 2 weeks down there. This it was, in fact, the tipping point. And that was my call to action. So, Cynthia, thank you so much for communicating with the rest of us. I look forward to a long, continuing conversation with you on this subject matter. The next speaker, Julie Wormser from Boston Harbor Associates. Let me just tell you a little bit about Boston Harbor Associates. When we brought the lawsuit to clean up Boston Harbor, it became very clear that government can only do so much. That it really is a citizenry that is passionate about a cause and continues year after the infrastructure and organizational aspects of a new organization such as the MWRA are put into place to carry that momentum forward, to keep the agency fresh and keep its feet to the fires, and to, again, coordinate between government and business and science and policy. Boston Harbor Association, is the organization that did the very first comprehensive study on rising sea levels in Boston. It wasn't the state that did it. It wasn't the feds that did it. It wasn't local government, the city, that did it. It was an organization of private citizens under the leadership of Julie Wormser and Vivian Lee, who have been in the trenches for a long time as true believers, trying to figure out how you marshal the strength of the private sector beyond these goals. And no one has done it better than the executive director of Boston Harbor Associates and the president, Vivian Lee, and the Boston Harbor Association that has brought to us a really solid, good look at what's going to happen in Boston and what we have to do about it. So with those words, I'd like to introduce to you Julie Wormser.
Thank you very much. So I was theoretically putting the finishing touches on this report on October 29th last year as my house was shaking, and we realized we needed to throw this out and start over because we'd have a much wider audience after Hurricane Sandy. This report, as folks have mentioned before, this was not the wake-up call. Really, Sandy was the wake-up call for coastal flooding. This was really a primer on what to do next. So we looked at, we did maps of Boston's vulnerability to coastal flooding. It's a bathtub model, not wind and waves. Looked at what private and public property owners could and needed to do to decrease risks. And then also identified case studies, including UMass Boston and our historical downtown wharves, to say how does one look at one's property and identify what to do over time. So Superstorm Sandy, 1,000 miles long. It devastated our transportation systems, cultural icons, electrical grid, residential areas. But this is what it looked like in Boston that day. This is what we get when we have a wicked high tide, is what we call it here. The astronomical high tide when the sun and the moon align and pull the ocean in the same direction. Why was it so different between Boston and Sandy? It wasn't just because, Boston and New York. New York City was really hit where Sandy landed, but it was more than that. Coastal flooding is from the wicked high tide. You know, what time of month does it occur? So in Boston, we get another foot or so of water, up to 2.5 feet of water, storm surges, and then underlying sea level rise. And I have a daughter who just finished tantruming in the bathtub, and I learned to lower that water in the bathtub to keep her from sloshing over onto the floor. But a very high level of water in a very tantrumy child versus a calm child and a low level of water makes a significant difference to the bathroom floor, as the equivalent does to one's streets and subways. So here's New York and here's Boston, about 400 miles apart. But more than that, Boston is protected by Cape Cod, Cape Ann, and offshore the Stellwagen Bank. As well, we have a very large, wide harbor with 34 islands before you hit downtown Boston. Unlike New York, which had water coming on both sides of New York, of Long Island, so the water piled up right near Manhattan and has a very narrow, almost islandless harbor, so there was nowhere for the water to go but up. What this means that in terms of storm surges, Boston's 1,000-year storm surge, which of course doesn't mean that once you get one, you get another millennium to get another one, means it's a 1 in 1,000 chance of hitting in a given year. Our 1,000-year storm surge is significantly lower than New York City's 100-year storm surge. So we located our state's capital in a very, very good harbor. Doesn't mean that the rest of Massachusetts doesn't get hammered. So during Sandy, while Boston was getting 2-foot waves, Scituate and Gloucester were getting 25-foot waves. But here's the tide gauge at the Battery. This is what it looked like during Hurricane Sandy. So the blue line is the predicted tide. The green line is the storm surge. The purple flat line is essentially wicked high tide. And then what happened is the high tide and the storm surge are additive. So what the Battery saw, Lower Manhattan saw, was an almost 14-foot storm surge, as Cynthia mentioned. In Boston, this is the Coast Guard station in Boston where we have our tide gauge in the Inner Harbor. Our wicked high tide happened 5.5 hours earlier. Our storm surge was lower, and it happened at low tide, which is why Boston was predominantly spared. The third piece, and I'll go back to that in a moment, the third piece is obviously underlying sea level rise. This is from the recent IPCC report, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. The difference in the ranges are business as usual carbon emissions versus doing something about it. But this relatively conservative report says we can expect a global average of 1 meter or over 3 feet of sea level rise by the year 2100, about a foot by mid-century, more in the Northeast. So when we did our report, we used the range of likely to possible sea level rise for planning purposes. Because even though an average rainstorm in Boston might be a couple inches, we've had 13-inch rainstorms. You don't want to just plan for the likely. You also want to plan for the probable or possible. So we looked at a 1 to 2 foot increase by 2050 as likely to possible, and a 3 to 6 foot increase by the turn of the century as likely to possible. So Boston, and as the data get better, each of these estimates keep going up, not down. So Boston, being very well situated, we have not had a whole lot of coastal flooding. We are very, very close to the water. That's our problem, really, is underlying sea level rise. So this is what happened in Hurricane Sandy. Again, we get a few of these a year. We got almost none of these until 1975. We've gotten up to 7 wicked high tides since, in a combination of a foot more of sea level and these astronomical high tides. So Sandy was one such. The yellow, just around our historical wharves, a little bit in South Boston, that's 0 to 2 feet of flooding. That's the picture you saw before. Had Sandy hit at high tide, all else equal, had Sandy hit Boston 5 hours earlier, this is the flooding we would have had. So this was a near miss. We got a second near miss in Nemo in February, 4 months later. So we had what we call we had near misses of 100-year floods 4 months apart. And again, as that underlying sea level increases, just like the level in a bathtub, you need smaller and smaller storms to overtop our seawalls. So this is 7% of Boston. It's our current 100-year flood. But with sea level rises of up to 2 feet by mid-century, sometime around mid-century, this could be an annual flood. What's really striking is this is our daily high tide by the turn of the century. This is a very different city without change. So what kinds of things flood at that level? I've been trying to call this the innovation district, not the inundation district, but this is the hottest new area in Boston, which is all landfill. 30% of the city is really reclaimed land from the sea, and this is no different. Bayside Expo, which UMass Boston just purchased probably for dorms, just down Columbia Point from us. Fort Point Channel, this is Gillette World Shaving Headquarters, where all Gillette razors are made. The USS Constitution, Charlestown Navy Yard, and even City Hall. So a 5-foot storm surge would actually go all the way through Faneuil Hall to the City Hall. This is what Boston would look like with 7.5 feet of water above our today's average high tide. This would be this is not today. This is Hurricane Sandy in 2050 at high tide, right? So more of those unlucky stars need to align to see this kind of flooding. But this is future flood levels in Boston. And you can see the original shape of the city start to emerge as the sea reclaims its own. This is more like 30% of the city, in part because it also overtops